I assume you know that we don't have an economic problem in the United States. We really don't. The current economy produces $200,000 for every family of four. It's a very rich economy for all of its faults. We have a political problem managing the richest economy in the history of the world. And I'm going to talk about the possibility of a transition to change the system. Now, that's the second point that I find people have trouble with. Most people know in some deep place that we're facing a systemic crisis and that you've got to change the system if you wanted to get anywhere near a decent society. People have a hunch about that. But my experience is most people don't believe that's possible. In fact, they have a vested interest, or we all have a vested interest in believing that's not possible. Because if it is possible, and you care about these things, we've got to do a lot of work. So pessimism has its own rewards. You get to sit back, why bother? Nothing matters anyway. So the argument of this book is that we face a systemic crisis, and more challenging than that it may be possible over time to transcend and change the system. Now, I am a realist. I ran House and Senate staffs. I've been involved in real politics. I'm a historian and a political economist. So I don't say it lightly, but that is the argument. And furthermore, and here's where it gets even more interesting from the perspective of a historian, political economist, and maybe some of you folks care about these things. The argument is that given the extraordinary wealth of the system, and it will be very, very wealthy, it may be possible to build a system that transcends the limits of the traditional systems that we know about. So if you don't like corporate capitalism and you don't like state socialism, what is it you want? And might there be a better alternative that is a system and an alternative that maybe we can get to? So in the 60s, that was called a heavy rap. That is to say, it opens up very, very challenging questions because most people really don't, down in their hearts, don't believe that's possible. So another way to get at this, and by way of introduction in a different place, the way to begin to think about this in terms of process is to imagine those farmers, mostly farmers, and few small business people, mostly small business men, not women, who in the late part of the 18th century thought they could take on the British Empire. And obviously a ridiculous idea at that time, most powerful empire in the history of the world, perhaps, at least at that point. And in fact, somehow a combination of conditions that limited the power of the empire, there was a war with France, and determination and anger and pain actually permitted over time, decade by decade, a transcendent revolution. That did happen. Or imagine, many of you, some of the older women perhaps in the audience will remember, some of the things in the 1940s, or at least your mothers would talk about, that women could not do. They couldn't have banking accounts. They had to get their husband to sign if they wanted to buy a house or a car. You couldn't get a job equal to a man's, et cetera, et cetera. And somehow, I mean, it would have been impossible to imagine that. And somehow, over time, there was a transcendence. Or more interestingly, and the point here is to look at time, not instantaneous. What are processes that go over time that might actually achieve power sufficient to alter fundamental conditions? More interesting, if you want to think about people who faced even more challenging difficulties and over time changed the system they were involved in. Think about people, and these are my heroes, by the way, civil rights workers in Mississippi in the 1930s and 40s. That's when the hard work was done, laying foundations, hard work and danger. Many were killed, many were tortured, laying foundations for what seemed impossible, and it became the explosion of the civil rights movement. So I want to give you the sense that when I say a revolution is possible, I mean step-by-step foundations may be being laid over the coming decades for something beyond which may catalyze in explosive qualities, but much more important is what's being built over time. And secondly, the pain levels that are driving that. So that's the context in which I'm kind of approaching this, and that's what the book's about. So the first thing to say about the actual argument of the book, and it is this argument that we face a systemic crisis, not a political crisis. It's not about the Tea Party. And it's not about the Republicans blocking things in the House. Certainly those are problems. But you can tell it is a systemic problem, and the test is very easy. When you have long trends of decay, irrespective of what happens in politics day by day, irrespective of what the Supreme Court does, and irrespective of the Tea Party. So for instance, over 30 years, the top 1% has taken literally all of the gains of the economic system to itself. It has gone from 20% of the income to 22 or 23 or 24, depends what year you measure. That means the bottom 99 lost all of that. That's a long 30-year trend, at least 30-year trend, that tells you there's something deeper in the system that's driving that. So if you look at CO2 production, again, since 1970, steady increase, 30% of CO2 increase, irrespective of attempts to control, and virtually all of them have failed. Or if you look at a measure of liberty, and I find this one particularly interesting because people talk about liberty in terms of what the Supreme Court does and the law and interpretations and the judges. But liberty, the best single test of liberty is how many people are deprived of it and put in prison. The United States has had a steady increase from about 93 per 100,000 up to about 750 per 100,000 over 30 years in prison. We have 8 times as many per capita in prison than any other advanced system, including Russia. So if you're looking at liberty, equality, I've talked about equality, liberty, ecological issues, on almost every major indicator, what you find are long trends that tell you that something deeper in the bowels of the system is driving this, irrespective of the Tea Party, who gets elected, et cetera. Now, there are exceptions. We can come to those in the question and discussion period if you like. But the big picture is that's what's been going on and is likely to continue to go on unless something changes. Now, one way to ask the question, what is a systemic crisis in the United States? And this is the second argument of the book, and a second argument that is very difficult, particularly for liberals to understand. Now, I come out of liberalism. I'm a Wisconsin progressive liberal. At least that's where I came from. I ran House and Senate staffs for liberal Wisconsin senators and congressmen. Gaylord Nelson, the founder of Earth Day, I was his legislative director. So I come out of the tradition I'm going to talk a little bit about and think is dying and almost and decaying before your eyes. The systemic design, let me use that word, the systemic design that we have lived with for a long time is the corporations are allowed to control the capital. And we attempt to countervail, John Kenneth Galbraith's term. We try to regulate, we try to tax, we try to spend for good things, we try to allocate resources that way. And that is the model that we've had. Let them have the capital and try to constrain them. In Europe, they call it social democracy. Here, it's called liberalism. At the core of that systemic design has been another institution besides the corporation. And that institution was organized labor in unions with money and muscle as institutions, not just movements. And one of the reasons those trends are going in the direction they're going, probably the most important single reason, is that labor has declined from 33.5% of the labor force being in unions in 1953, just after World War II, down now to the 11% range, and 6.6 in the private sector, and decaying. So the whole model, which was kept sort of in line by a design that had some institutions with great power and some attempting to countervail or keep them in line, that model is decaying before your eyes. And that is probably the most important single reason the trends that you see are going in the direction you see. Now, I should be disturbing you with that, because that, if you understand that argument, the whole structure that we have been living with is in radical decay. And there's no obvious way out of the box. Furthermore, most people don't have any idea of what it would be if you got out of the box. If you don't like corporate capitalism, and most people don't like state socialism, what is it that might make sense if that design is gone? Do you understand how challenging the question really is? If you take it very seriously, what in the world, you know, Margaret Thatcher had the famous line, TINA, T-I-N-A, there is no alternative, was her argument. It's only capitalism once the Soviet Union collapsed. So that's a serious argument. If you were to go in a new direction, where is it you want to go? Now, I think there's an answer to that question, or I wouldn't have written this book. And I think people are beginning to move in the direction of an answer and building towards an answer. But I think it's a very serious question that anyone serious about politics needs to contend with if the arguments I've suggested are right, if we are in a systemic crisis. So briefly, systems logically, for the most part, revolve around who's got the wealth. In feudalism, the lords, the church, and the landed gentry and the king all had the wealth, and they had the power. In 19th century capitalism, small businessmen mostly had the power, had the wealth. And most of the small businessmen, and they were men, were farmers. They were not peasant farmers. They were capitalist farmers in the marketplace, small businessmen. They sold their grain in the marketplace, and when the market went up and down, they went up and down. Very different from European structure. And there was a sort of populist quality to that, or at least something like it, but very different from corporate capitalism. Corporate capitalism, the corporations have the power, have the capital, and by and large, at the end of the 19th century and for a good part of the early part of the 20th century, they ran the game unimpeded by labor and labor's allies. And obviously, I'm oversimplifying just to sketch these things. That system, corporation owning the capital, by the way, can come in different flavors, if you like. One is simply corporate capitalism without labor unions, as in the beginning part of the 20th century, great power. Or the model that is decaying, liberalism, corporations, and kind of balanced by labor and the social democratic policies. Or the other third model, well-known model of corporate capitalism is fascism. Corporations have the power, but with authoritarian rule, as in Latin America, as in Germany and Italy during the second part of the second 3 decades of the century. So the question becomes, is there a way beyond that? And if you don't like state socialism, is there any other place to put the capital? If systems revolve significantly about who controls capital, not entirely, there are cultural and other factors, but if the control of capital yields great power, and if you have a system design that doesn't deal with who gets to control the capital, you probably don't have a systemic design that will last. So that's the challenge. And if it isn't in the state, and if it's not in the corporations, and it's not in the landed lords, where else might capital be built up in a system that would be democratic, perhaps ecologically sustainable, perhaps concerned with community, and perhaps concerned with the well-being of a larger majority? Well, it turns out there are traditions that have asked that question. Moreover, there are experiments, and a lot of them. Moreover, in the United States, there's a lot going on which begins to suggest a different direction and maybe even a systemic design. So the first argument becomes, if you put it in the state, it concentrates power. But maybe there are other places that, in fact, people can put capital in ways that decentralize power. So that's an opening question. That's not an answer. That's an opening question for your systemic design. And maybe, and here's the second part of the argument, there may be pathways forced by the pain of the failing system. Let me say that again. There may be pathways forced by the pain of the decaying system that allow the transcending slow development of alternative places to build up capital in a democratic form that is decentralized and changes power relationships at the same time as it opens up new vistas and new visions. Maybe. So how do you even begin to get a handle on what that might look like, particularly in the United States? Well, one way is to begin looking around the country, and we do a lot of research on this at the University in Maryland and in the Democracy Collaborative. for alternative structures that democratize the ownership of wealth and that are expanding. That's a starting place. That's not an answer. That's a starting place. And some of them are old structures which are undergoing kind of transformation and renewal, and some of them are new ones. So what do I mean? The most obvious one is the Gardenvariety co-op. One person, one vote, ownership of wealth. There are 130 million Americans who are members of co-ops, and co-ops and credit unions, which is also a co-op form. That's 40% of the society. Very interesting. And the credit unions themselves, been there a long time, standing there, kind of an ordinary, mundane institution. Taken together, they have more capital than any one of the giant 5 big New York banks. And what's happening in a number of the credit unions is there is a process. People have realized they're one person, one vote. That means you can go to the annual meeting as a member. In fact, you can join. And if you go to the annual meeting, you'll find that in this boring institution that's been giving loans for cars and houses, nobody comes to the meeting because nobody cares. But some people in several parts of the country are electing new members to the board and asking that they use the power of all that capital for some more creative things. So it's a very interesting kind of little sliver of an idea. There it exists, huge amount of wealth, huge capital, and decentralized in its structure. There's another place. Most people don't know there are 11 million Americans who are members of worker-owned companies. That's about 3 million more than are members of unions in the private sector. The press, by the way, doesn't cover any of this. It's very important. They don't have the money, and they don't have the interest, they don't have the reporting staffs. So you have to really dig to find out these things that are pretty obvious if you look at them. There are 11 million people in worker-owned companies. Another illustration, suggestive, not definitive, suggestive of a different way to organize the ownership of wealth and capital institutionally. That might be another place to look for building up something more in the direction of a new system. You probably didn't realize, and I didn't until I studied it and began digging, doing the research for this book, that 25% of American electricity is generated by socialist institutions. I mean really socialist institutions. City-owned utilities and co-ops. And there they exist all around the country, and many of them are beginning to take on new forms. For instance, they're getting into internet development, they're doing green projects, they're becoming oriented to trying to transform different parts of the local economy. And that institution has power which is not yet tapped. And there it is, another form of ownership that is decentralized and gives you another ingredient to begin thinking about as possibly building up. There are many, many more of these. The book covers different sectors. Social enterprise, another form. Now, there are a whole lot of folks involved in social enterprise. There is one called Credo. How many folks used Credo? Credo came out of Working Assets. It's a company set up and makes a lot of money. It's set up to make money and use it for social and political purposes. And there are several thousand of those around the country that you don't find written about. But again, changing ownership for a political and social purpose. That's another example. The neighborhood corporations are out there as well. There are about 5,000 of them in the country. Some boring, some interesting, and some getting very interesting indeed. The developing large-scale ownership. There's one in New Jersey that has 1,400 employees, very large owner, and owns land and stores, and so by a neighborhood structure. Another piece of the puzzle. So I'm throwing out lots of illustrations because the book is filled with things that, by the way, you can do here. That's a sidebar. What we're finding is people don't know about what's happening in the next city and don't know about it, and they think it's impossible. Actually, when you actually give information, has power sometimes. And I'll tell you a couple stories about that. So land ownership is another piece of the puzzle. Land is the critical one in city development. These are, if you like, pebbles and ingredients for something that might be taken and built using these pebbles and ingredients of actual real experience that suggests decentralized ways to own capital. And they are all growing. That's the interesting part of this. And they're growing largely because of pain and difficulty and no answer out of the political and economic system. So you're seeing people resorting to this kind of effort because they're not getting answers out of the political system and because social and economic pain is growing. Let me give you another one on land trusts. How many know what a land trust is? You draw a circle around several acres or whatever size you want. You socialize it, either through a nonprofit corporation that has a public purpose or by city government. Now, 35 years ago, you couldn't find any land trusts in the United States. There were two that started up by people who were veterans of the civil rights movement, Bob Swan in Vermont and the Sherrods in Georgia. And they socialized the land. They put a nonprofit corporation in order to control land inflation and also to preserve the land in a different way. And it was a very interesting idea that everyone thought was a silly idea, kind of marginal. There are hundreds and hundreds of land trusts now around the country, some of them very large. In Irvine, California, there are 5,000 units of housing in land trusts. What it means is that if you put the land under public or quasi-public or nonprofit ownership, you can control the gentrification process. So instead of prices going up and the poor kicked out, some part of it can be allowed to go up and you cross-subsidize the other parts. So that's a way of socializing land and capturing the surpluses and pouring them back in for other purposes, not attempting the tax route, which is controlled by the developers. Do you understand the model? If you change the ownership structure, you control the surplus, and you can use it for public purpose. So let me give you another illustration that the press doesn't cover. It used to be, I'll stop giving you illustrations after a while, but I just want you to get the feel of what's out there, because this is the nitty-gritty of the kind of slow, quiet things that the press isn't covering. In most cities, if the city government and the taxpayers put a big investment in for subways and mass transit, at every exit, the values of the land will go up. Why? Because there's a lot of people there, stores make money there, housing is great there. So the public investment creates land values that the developers capture. That's the typical way it's run. Not anymore. Most cities now socialize the land and then lease it to the developer instead of trying to tax it back. Would you please possibly give us a little tax money? No, take it over by city ownership of the land at the exits. Then the public investment creates surpluses, which are directly taken by the city by leasing the land at whatever the price will be and using the surplus for taxpayers. These are all micro forms of changing ownership, and they are all growing partly by virtue of the tax crisis, partly by virtue of pain, and partly by virtue of development. Probably the most important part of this, a lot of young people are getting involved in this. Everywhere I've gone, you find people trying to build new co-ops, getting very sophisticated about co-op development, land trust development, agriculture. A lot of it's green, and they're beginning to take into their own hands the redesign of this kind of effort. Most interesting part of this is when you stand back as a historian and look at some of the processes at work in a historical perspective. I've just been giving you illustrations. So let me give you another way to come at this. I'm going to come at it 6 or 7 different ways and then kind of try to draw a little put a little ribbon on it and talk about it in a different way. I was involved with the Youngstown steel collapse in 1977. How many know about that? Some old hands. Okay, Youngstown was a very, very big deal. 5,000 steel workers lost their jobs in one day, 1977, and it was national news. The reason it was national news, it hadn't happened before. It happens all the time now, so it isn't national news. And besides, the press isn't interested. What was interesting about it was the steel workers and the local religious leaders saw what would happen to that town if the steel mill went down. It would take a good part of the town with it. And so they got the crazy idea that why shouldn't we set up a worker community-owned mill, take it over, refurbish it, and put it back to work under that kind of ownership structure. Crazy idea. But they did their politics, and they organized, and they got the Carter administration at that time to finance a very sophisticated study of how you could actually do it by the top experts in the steel industry. And then they forced the Carter administration to pledge $200 million in loan guarantees. This is 1977. Multiply that by 5 and you get some idea of how big the numbers really would be today. And the Carter administration did make that pledge. After the election of 1978, the money kind of went away. But they knew it might. They were serious political people, And so their fallback plan B that they knew about was to try to educate throughout the state and throughout the country that this was an idea whose time has got to come. And they thought, we may lose the battle, but maybe we'll win the war if we look at it in the way I suggested, 30-year trends of the women's movement in the Mississippi and thinking about long trends. Well, in Ohio today, you'll find more worker-owned companies per capita probably than any other state because of that work. And furthermore, there's been evolution, and this is the concept to get clear on. Out of the pain and difficulty, because there aren't any other answers and no jobs, a lot of the country looks like Ohio has looked for the last 30 years. The Rust Belt states went first. Out of that pain, there's also been innovation and sophistication and further development, not just numbers. So in Cleveland today, you will find a complex of large-scale worker-owned companies linked together by a revolving fund and linked together also by a nonprofit corporation so that they make money to help rebuild the community, as well as with the revolving fund, keep starting new worker-owned companies. So what I mean, they're really significant companies. They just opened about 2.5 months ago, the largest urban greenhouse in the United States. It has a capacity, it's a hydroponic, it has the capacity to produce 3 million heads of lettuce a year. It's very large scale. I learned, this kind of blew me away. To do that, you have to plant 26,000 heads of lettuce every day. So these are not small operations. They have a very large scale greenhouse, industrial scale greenhouse to serve laundry to the hospitals in the area. And also there's a solar installation company online to put in just about double the amount of solar that exists in Ohio. And the idea is to keep building a complex that builds the community. And they're not freestanding worker-owned companies. They're linked together to build the community. They can't run off. And that's the idea. So notice you've got an increase in scale and innovation, and now it's a community building structure. Some of you know about Mondragon in the Basque country of Spain. This is built in part on Mondragon, but the community structure is even more innovative. So the thing to look at there is over 30 years, not only growth in numbers, but growth in sophistication. And furthermore, very interesting, they're in the middle, every city's got this, in the middle of this very poor neighborhood, 40,000 people, mostly black, 40% unemployment, 40% unemployment, average family income 18,000. This is what is happening. In the middle, there are big hospitals and universities. Case Western Reserve, Cleveland Clinic, University Hospital, right in the middle of that. And that's true of many places. They're called anchor institutions. They are anchored. They can't get up and go like major corporations who come into a community and then go after they take the tax benefits. They're there. You have them too. In that particular neighborhood, and this is part of the evolution, they purchase $3 billion, with a B, dollars in goods and services a year. That's leaving, plus their salaries and plus their construction, just what they buy. None of it until recently from that area. And a good part of it is financed by taxpayers. Educational money, Medicare, Medicaid, it's all flowing into those hospitals and universities. So the light bulb has gone on, and this is another part of the evolution to get them to purchase from community building structures that are worker owned, and the revolution will come. Community building structures that are worker owned, but also sophisticated in that they're tapping into existing institutions and building out from that structure. It is somewhat of a planning system with a public market or quasi-public market to stabilize a whole different structure of ownership. And it is being supported by small businessmen as well as the poor community because it helps the entire community. Very interesting structural advance in sophistication. So the ball to keep your eye on here is not only numbers that the press doesn't cover, but evolution in design and complexity and sophistication in the design. And there's another piece of evolution that if you watch closely, things the press doesn't cover. In the state of Ohio in 1977, the local steel workers, the ones who lost their jobs, were the ones who were innovating and really wanted to save that mill. That means they were activists. The international leadership didn't want to have more activists. And they opposed the local effort. In fact, probably, though we can't prove it, they probably went to Washington with the corporations to cut down the steel, this local kind of hot young thing that was building up with a lot of energy. And it disappeared. Now that's the way it was in 1977. But there is now evolution there as well. The United Steelworkers' top national and international leadership is now leading the fight to have worker community-owned structures around the country. They are pushing now for ownership by workers. Big change in the unions. Looking to, notice the model. The model is now moving towards an ownership model, democratizing ownership, a worker-owned company, rather than simply trying to regulate the corporations, because you do whatever you can on that front. Begin shifting institutional power and make it more and more sophisticated. That's a whole track that's going on. There are 3 or 4 tracks like that I cover in the book, the point of which is that pain levels and the absence of any realistic solution the old way are forcing people more and more to innovate and to realize they can innovate. And if the guys did it in Cleveland, why can't we do it here? That kind of thing's happening. And young people particularly, beginning, the light bulbs are going on saying, if they can do it, why can't we? And that is beginning to happen, particularly on this side. The worker co-op movement is very, very intense. 2 or 3 other tracks, and I'll do these rather quickly because of the time available. There are other things going on in different parts of the system that are really attention to which must be paid. And they all end up with somehow democratizing ownership in decentralized ways. So for instance, how many know about the Bank of North Dakota? Yeah, there you go. People here know. All right. From North Dakota, probably. From here, great. The Bank of North Dakota is a socialist bank. The state-owned bank's been there since the early part of the 20th century. It's owned by the bank. The profits go to the taxpayers. It's supported by the farmers and the small businessmen, and there it is, sitting there. So something like 20 states have introduced legislation to have a bank like the Bank of North Dakota. And that's another movement that's building up. And I think will continue to build up. Still another piece of the puzzle, and this one may be even the most important one sitting there. The healthcare system uses 18% of the GDP, almost a fifth of the economy, pretty much double what any other healthcare system uses. You know, most are in the 10, 11%, some less than that, and usually they all have better outcomes. Ours is double the cost and the worst outcomes by far. And the cost structure is continuing. As the financial pressure continues, and it is getting worse in the healthcare system, and costs are getting worse, what you're already seeing, and you're going to see more of, is the corporations are going to start taking the penalties and getting rid of the insurance, and people are going to be thrown off their insurance. That's happening around the country. There's more and more pain is happening, and the cost structure is growing up. Where the rubber hits the road is in the states. And state by state by state, we're beginning to see some 20 states have introduced legislation to have single payer in states. The furthest along is Vermont, which will have it in 2014. California passed it twice, and it was vetoed twice by the last governor. We'll see what happens with the new governor. So there is the thing to watch here is not whether this is good guys and bad guys. There is a dynamic that's creating this. The pressures of costs in the healthcare system and the pain levels are forcing a possible transformation of the healthcare system, agonizing state by state by state over the coming decades. The things I've been talking about at the local level are being driven by pain levels and the absence of a solution, state by state by state. If you look at banking, that's another possibility at a very different level, and this is a third process. There are about 4 that I would outline for you. Most people who look at the banking system at the national level, and the experts on this are left, right, and center, are almost unanimous in predicting another major financial crisis. Almost unanimous, left, right, and center. The reason is the banks are too big to regulate. They control the action. And I worked in the House and Senate, and it means that lobbyists are everywhere, and they find ways to do very small changes which have huge implications, and they control that action. The Attorney General of the United States, I don't know if you all saw this, about 3 weeks ago, testifying before Congress, asking, why haven't you taken any of these people to court who have committed crimes? And he said, basically, they're too big to take to court. That means they can do whatever they want because the Attorney General isn't going to sue them. that whole system is very shaky. And there's a great deal of anger by the banks. I mean, the current nostrum, and I say that delicately because I would like to see it happen, is break them up. Break up the big banks. Sherrod Brown's got legislation to produce that, and I think that's a good idea. But I don't have any illusions about it, and I don't think you should either. If you look at the history of AT&T, or if you look at the Standard Oil, you break them up, and then the big fish eat the little fish, and you're back at the trough. The people who understood this best, and I think this is what will happen over the coming decades. Now notice what I'm doing, you guys. Notice what I'm doing. There's a great pain level. The system is not working because the old balances are gone. Pain is developing at the local level, all sorts of interesting things, decentralized ownership things. At the state level, interesting things going on with banking. At the city level, land trusts, all kinds of odd things. The healthcare system has got another dynamic, and it moves in the direction of single payer, which is another way to have public ownership of the system, piece by piece by piece at the state level. And the banking system is another part. That's a different level crisis, which because it may be national, may take a different track at the national level. It's the first time I've said anything about national. I'm talking about building over time from the bottom up so far. And again, because the old system can't solve problems. If you start thinking about that particular part of it, there's a whole different dynamic that looks like this. And the people who understood this best, I take my hat off to them, and you will be surprised, are the conservative economists of the Chicago School of Economics who were Milton Friedman's teachers. Now, why in the world would I say something like that to an audience like this, right? Because they were honest men. They were interested in a free market, small business economy that actually was a free market economy, rather than one that was rigged by the big corporations. They saw the big banks and the big corporations as destructive of what they wanted, which was a free market economy. And they were sophisticated about it. They said, well, if you try to regulate those guys, they will take over the regulators. They got Nobel Prizes for the argument. They made a very sophisticated argument. All right, that's the liberal nostrum. I used to do that when I worked in the House and Senate. You try to regulate them. That's how we're going to do climate change, right? We're going to try to regulate them. But they're powerful enough, too powerful, so they regulate the regulators. Swarms of lobbyists with a lot of money and a lot of lawyers, and sitting down opposite young kids working like me, young kids working in the House and Senate, and saying to them, you know, gosh, you're very smart. You know, I'm not trying to say anything to you, but you know, when you're done with this, there may be some other jobs paid 3 times as much because you got some experience. It's a really vicious game. But the problem is that it doesn't answer the problem, and the problem gets worse and worse. So the judgment call there is that as that goes on, we're likely to see more and more crisis. And what the Chicago schools guys said, you also can't break them up. He said if you break them up, they'll regroup. It's obvious. Anybody who knows anything about institutional dynamics. So the Chicago school economists, Milton Friedman's teachers, and his most revered teacher, Henry C. Simon, the founder of the Chicago School, argued as follows. Well, to preserve a free market, since we can't regulate them, it won't work, and since we can't break them up, we have to turn them into public utilities. We have to socialize them. That's the only logical option. But they're right. Quite apart from good guys and bad guys, that's the only option available if you can't regulate and if you can't break them up. That's what's left. And I think that's where we're going to see, you know, we may go once or twice or 3 times down that road. But at some point, the anger at the big banks, left, right, and center, I think is going to take us in that direction. Now remember, I'm a historian. I'm talking about the next decades, not the next week. But if the pain levels continue, and think about this part, and if people learn in their own experience something about how to democratize ownership really, from land trusts, from local businesses, from local utilities, from just ordinary experience, that's the kind of thing that led to the prehistory of the New Deal, where the developments that became national at the New Deal time were developed case by case by case in the states and localities until the moment came when they could be applied nationally. And if there is no solution nationally, by the way, I'm not urging this. I'm suggesting this is a pattern. I would urge it, but there is an emerging pattern that cannot solve the problems. And somehow or another, the logic offers this option, and probably only this option, or the pain gets worse. One final of the 3 or 4 different tracks, one final track just to toss out to think about. And this is the point. If you look closely, in many, many areas, the same logic is emerging out of this pain and out of the failure of the system to regulate and manage itself. I don't know if you noticed, but we nationalized 2 of the big car companies. A couple of years ago, we did do that. We nationalized big companies. And we nationalized and still own as a public resource AIG, the largest insurance company in the world. The Americans in this conservative country nationalizing companies, we in fact have done that, and with the politics we now have, use taxpayer monies to give it back. It may well be in the next, or the one beyond that crisis, at some point, if there's a buildup of real experience, some of those big ones will stay in the public realm and begin to be used to stabilize cities and build mass transit and vehicles and the sort of thing that you could do if you were intelligent about using those resources in a different way. And if people had actually experienced in their own lives and in their own communities different ways to organize production, worker co-ops, the sort of models where you use quasi-public money. You know, if you think about it this way, if hospitals and universities have a lot of public money in it, and they stabilize worker-owned companies and stabilize the community, the day we have mass transit and high-speed rail companies at the national level, they could perform much larger forms of the same thing, stabilizing communities. Now, this is all obviously very utopian talk. You don't believe any of this stuff. It's very hard to stand back and say, the pain levels, in fact, are systemically driven and are not going to go away. And therefore, people are being forced to do things that are very hard, not because they want to. What they would like is the old way back. But the agony and pain is the driver to look at. And if the logic of this discussion, the collapse of labor and the collapse of the liberal solution, that model is decaying, there either is no solution, or it will be a solution that is built up agonizingly, step by step, over time, you want to play this game? Throw a few decades of your life on the table. Over time, laying down knowledge, experience, foundation, inspiration, learning from one community to another, that kind of hard historical work, that's the way the women's movement built it, that's the way the civil rights movement built it, that's the way historical change occurs. I don't think we are in the stage of changing the system. I think we may be in the prehistory. Think about that. The prehistory of a great transformation. Now that happens to be the hardest place. That's like those Mississippi people 30 years ago. That's what the hard place where the really challenge. It's all very easy to join a movement when the movement's moving. Some of you folks have been in civil rights and environmental. It's real easy once the movement's moving because there's a lot of excitement and energy. The place for the heroics is now. People willing to roll up their sleeves and begin to develop the models and say, if you don't like corporate capitalism and you don't like state socialism, there is a very, and this is the interesting part to me, a very, very American feel to this kind of stuff. It's very down home. It starts at the local level. This is not France. These are Americans who roll up their sleeves and kind of get to work locally. It has a really nice American cultural feel to it too, starting at the bottom, starting in communities and building community forward. Now, you know, the logic of, I'm a historian and political economist, so I'm going to end with this. The logic is like this. It is possible that nothing can change. Certainly possible that the decay will continue and the pain will continue. Decay and decay, decay. Rome decayed. That's possible. It's possible that there will be decay and violence, and with violence, repression, and a corporate state of some kind, maybe even something looking like fascism. That's possible. No illusions. On the other hand, look to Latin America. Those dictators who were there aren't there anymore. So that isn't the end of history necessarily, though it might be. They may last forever. It's possible that the kind of work that's happening may simply bolster the old liberalism, that these co-ops and different things I've talked about may give a little nudge and keep it in place, and the system won't really progress, but it will not collapse, and it'll be a little better. It would be an improvement. We'll take an improvement. But it is also possible, speaking as a historian, and I ask you to think as a historian, it is also possible, as in many, many parts of the world, think of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, think of apartheid collapsing, think of the French Revolution, the American Revolution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Revolutions are, and I exaggerate slightly, they're as common as grass in world history. And always they seem impossible. So one last, if I say one last word, don't believe me, but, but I will say one last word. So I'm kind of cool about this. I actually think we're in a process of many decade development, and it's a very exciting process if you see it with these kind of perspectives. If you see that's what then must we do is to further the process. That's what the book argues, that this is happening, but it's not intentional. It's not sophisticated. It isn't when intention and clarity and choice are added to emergent processes. You get a very different power dynamic. So let me say that again. This stuff is happening. It's not intentional yet. It's not part of a strategic decision of people to invest and go this direction yet. When that happens, something different happens. That's when movements begin to move. So I think we're even in the prehistory of a potentially great movement. That's really the interesting part of this sort of thing. I was going to say something in this last moment, but I think I'm going to sit down and leave it at that. Thank you very much for having me. Sir.
You didn't mention anything about the war economy of the United States or the foreign policy, the destructive foreign policy of the U.S., I should say.
My own quest in this direction started at that end. Started with foreign policy questions. He mentioned the book about the atomic bomb. And that began as a study of American imperialism, and only found out about the bomb later. So, and one of the questions at the source of the American imperial strategy is systems that must expand by virtue of their capitalist dynamic. There are other dynamics that expand, but the driving force of American imperialism was the source of going for markets, needing resources, needing investment outlets, et cetera, in the late part of the 19th century. It's been well described historically. But systems that must expand tend to produce imperial relationships. They try to control the markets and the communities and so forth. So that's where I'm coming from originally. And what the kinds of systems, think about the model that's stabilized in Cleveland or stabilized by virtue of the car production, which is stable. It's not a market. It's a stable system, a quasi-public market. Those models are the kind of models that interest me for that fundamental reason. But to answer your question more directly, I think the American empire is in great decay and is being forced back upon itself. And I think that, on the whole, is a good thing. And I think we need to help that process along. But you know, interestingly, military spending is very large, but it has radically declined as a share of the economy over the last 50 years. It was 42% during World War II of the economy. It peaked at 14% in the Korean War, averaged 10% in the 1950s. In the Vietnam War era, it peaked at 8.8%. It's now moving towards less than 3% of the economy. And great damage is being done. Great damage is being done. But two things. One, it means that you don't stimulate the economy domestically in the way that it's very large, but not large relative to the economy, which means that the pain levels are going to continue, forcing the large processes I've been talking about, contributing to the pain levels and the processes. On the other hand, and this is the hard part for most people, I think there's a lot we can do to change American foreign policy. But I don't think you get much change until you change the system. And when I worked in the State Department, what happened is very good people were trying to do things in the developing world and come up with a program. By the time it hit the ground, the corporations had turned it. And I don't think you're going to get much change until we change. So we can do what we can to try to limit, constrain. But if you want to change American foreign policy, you've got to change the system, because it is being generated from very deep sources within the system and largely corporate sources. So I'm kind of a hard liner on that. I think it's utopian to think we're going to change much in our foreign policy stance until we actually change who we are and our whole structure of corporate capitalism. Sir.
is there any hope that that some of the libertarians, idealistic libertarians among the Tea Party people or others, groups on the left, on the right, will actually do some good in getting rid of corruption, and can there be a cooperation between progressives and some of these libertarians to achieve like end of militarism, but also true economic reform?
Yeah, I think the libertarians and the Tea Party people, the Tea Party is a very small and highly publicized group. Highly publicized, but very small. People with attitudes of the kind that are anti-corporate and anti-big government and anti-military are large. But they're not necessarily, they always get mushed together with, these are all Tea Party people. I think there is a base for kind of cooperation on many things that begin with a localist vision amongst those people. I'm from Racine, Wisconsin. That's a dying industrial town in the Midwest. When I go back home and talk to my high school buddies, some of whom are very conservative, but also very smart, their openness and interest in a community building kind of vision that's practical is much, much more open than the kind of crazies you see on television. And in the Cleveland model, you see local businessmen are helping try to set it up for worker ownership. They're trying to help this process, not thwart it. So yes, there are the Tea Party, and they get a lot of press. But there's also a great deal more openness, and I think, and intelligence amongst some of these folks. That the key part of this that I've experienced, we do a lot of work on this stuff in different communities. The really important thing is, does it make sense? Are these projects practical? Can you explain them, or is it just a bunch of rhetoric? And if it is actually something that makes sense, you can explain it. And if you can explain it and it makes sense, you'd be surprised how many people will listen, because there's a lot of pain that they're feeling too. This is an answer. So lots of communities are experimenting with it, some very conservative ones. The stuff in Cleveland, by the way, there are about 10 communities trying to do the same thing already, and about 100 have inquired about using the same power of the anchor institutions to build up worker ownership and stabilize the base. In some very conservative communities, by the way. Sir?
One of the things that happened historically in the 30s and in the 20s, when those local experiments were starting up, was that they were run by the kind of people that you just talked about, people that could talk to ordinary people, make the case, make it from a practical point of view, make it out of necessity, and have a very sort of human, Americans are great pragmatists. It's like, here's the nuts and bolts, here's how it works. What I frankly, and I say this as a progressive, what I frankly see among my fellow progressives is we have a tendency to not be able to do that well. We have our own specialized language, we have our own specialized way of talking, we are arrogant, we are not good at talking to people who are not leftists, we are self-isolators, and we get into internecine arguments over nothing. And so there's that tendency, and anybody who's spent any time on the left in this country knows it. And so I'm sure you've seen that, and do you have anything to say about like what we could possibly do to overcome that?
Well, two things. One, the analogy is a very good point. That a lot of the things that became the New Deal were in fact cooked at the state and local level, and then the moment arose, they went national. And that's kind of the process I'm describing here, right? As a maybe process. Well, first, younger people, there's something else going on. Lots of younger people are much more talking to each other in a different way. Some of them get kind of weird, but there are other people who are kind of open to a sense of community and trying to reach out to people. So I'm not so sure people our age, we may learn something from other people. And yes, it's true. I think parts of the progressive movement, parts of the left don't want to talk to Americans. But it's a narrow circle, so that means we have to clean up our act, and that's the only way to say it. That is, get out there and do it, and stop that nonsense. We'll see how it goes, but I think the next generation. Here's another number which I should have mentioned because it tickles people, but it tells you about where younger people are. Have you seen the polls on the word socialism? Yeah, there are 3 polls and one finding. The finding is that. On people under 30, the last 3 polls show more people slightly favor the term socialism rather than capitalism. Slightly favor, that's the poll data, which means that it doesn't have all that crazy stuff that we had in the McCarthy era and so forth. So that's number one. The other one is, it's not a poll data, but it's a finding. Merriam-Webster dictionary, the online dictionary, the two most looked up words last year were socialism and capitalism as a pair. So it means young people are looking for different answers. I think we've gone through a period where the left was so isolated by the triumph of the system, plus repression. But the system was triumphant, and there seemed no way out. The left's got a lot of learning to do, but I think there's a lot of learning from the people who are doing practical things on the ground. It's forcing people to begin to think in a different way. Let us hope. Yes. Yep.
If any at all?
Well, that's really, it's very interesting because what I've suggested is that there are many, many places in the country, because of the failures of the system, we're experiencing buildups of non-reported democratization projects on many kinds, changing the ownership of capital. The academy, the next question is, that isn't yet a system. That's not a systemic design. These are ingredients of what might become the elements of a systemic design that might preserve and build communities from the bottom up and stabilize. I take up sort of a sketch of that in the afterword of this book, where this might point. But there's a hell of a lot of important work to do on analyzing this, on learning from other countries, on thinking about the planning problems involved. That kind of work the academy could begin to turn to. And some people are slowly. For instance, there's a political science, it's interesting things going on. The president of the American Political Science Association this year is a woman at Harvard named Jane Mansbridge. Her whole career is about how you build up democracy from the bottom up. And that's her, and she's the president of the American Sociological Association last year is a guy from Wisconsin, Eric Olin Wright, who has published an extraordinary book, which I recommend to you, which is all about examples around the world that can be drawn on. He calls it practical utopias. But for instance, the Mondragon system is analyzed, and what's going on in the French-Canadian parts, there's very interesting, complex things going on in Quebec. And he goes through model after model after model, which can be drawn upon. So there's a whole lot of, if the academy began looking at this stuff as the way engineers think about things. How could we do it if we wanted to, rather than how we run the numbers and criticize it? There's a lot of work that could be done. Of course, you have to reform the academy. I know about the economics departments. I fled the country.